She was 21 and had just been thrown out. No family left in the county, no savings, just a canvas rucksack and $10 she had earned stacking hay at a cattle farm outside Stewart. And with that $10, she bought an old blacksmith shop at a crossroads in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia, in a stretch of Patrick County that had not heard an anvil ring since the shop had closed in 1942. The stone walls had gone dark with forge soot. The chimney stack was choked with creeper. But what nobody knew was that hidden under the anvil block of that old shop was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Bray Collier had grown up with the color of hot iron, not the color of a sunset, and not the color of a campfire. The specific graduated color of a piece of iron heated in a forge. The color that told a blacksmith the exact temperature of the metal without a thermometer. Black at room temperature, then dark red at 900 degrees, then cherry red at 1,400, then bright orange at 1,800, then yellow at 2,100, and finally white at 2,300, which was the temperature at which iron could be forge welded. 2 pieces of white hot iron pressed together on the anvil and struck, the heat so intense that the surfaces of the 2 pieces fused into one piece, the weld invisible, the joint as strong as the original metal. Her grandmother had taught her to read those colors the way certain grandmothers in certain mountain counties teach a child the one thing the mountains have always needed, by standing the child beside the forge and letting her watch the iron change color, until the watching became knowing. Her grandmother's name was Iva Collier, and she had been a blacksmith, a woman who had forged iron by hand for the farms, homesteads, and timber operations of Patrick County, Virginia, for 29 years. Iva had not been a farrier or a welder or a metal worker in the modern sense. Eva had been a general smith, a person who could make anything the county needed from a bar of iron and a fire, hinges for barn doors, latches for gates, hooks for hanging meat in the smokehouse, chains for dragging logs, tongs for handling hot iron, fireplace cranes for hanging pots, and the tool that every farm required and no farm could do without, the nail. Before the wire nail factories, every nail in every building in the Blue Ridge had been hand-forged by a blacksmith, one at a time, from a rod of iron heated in the forge and drawn to a point on the anvil and headed with a single blow of the hammer. A good smith could forge a nail in 45 seconds. A great smith could forge one in 30. Eva had been born in 1937 in a cabin at a crossroads outside the village of Woolwine, Patrick County, the daughter of a Scots-Irish farmer and part-time smith named Elam Collier, who had farmed 40 acres of steep Blue Ridge hillside and who had kept a forge in a stone outbuilding beside the barn because a mountain farmer who could not shoe his own horse and forge his own hinges was a mountain farmer who depended on a trip to town. And the trip to town was 12 miles of mountain road that took half a day by wagon. Elam had been the smith for the crossroads, not a professional blacksmith but a farmer who could work iron, which in the Blue Ridge in the 1930s was every third farmer, because the mountains required self-sufficiency and self-sufficiency required iron and iron required fire. Elam had taught Iva the forge at 7. He had lit the fire, a coke fire which was coal that had been pre-burned to remove the sulfur and the volatiles, leaving a dense carbon fuel that burned hotter and cleaner than raw coal, and had pumped the bellows until the fire was white at the center, and had placed a half-inch square bar of wrought iron into the fire, and had said, "Watch the color. The color is the temperature. When the iron turns dark red, it is soft enough to bend. When it turns cherry red, it is soft enough to shape. When it turns orange, it is soft enough to draw. When it turns yellow, it is soft enough to upset. And when it turns white, the color of the sun, it is soft enough to weld. You do not need a thermometer, you need eyes." Eva had watched the iron change color in the fire. Dark red creeping up the bar from the end closest to the coals, the red deepening to cherry, the cherry brightening to orange, the orange shifting to yellow at the tip. And she had understood, at 7, that the forge was a painter, and the iron was the canvas, and the colors were the instructions. Elam had also taught Iva the 4 fundamental operations of blacksmithing, the 4 things a smith could do with hot iron that produced every tool, every fastener, every piece of hardware the mountains required. Drawing was making the iron longer and thinner, stretching a bar by hammering it on the flat face of the anvil, each blow pushing the soft metal outward along its length. Upsetting was making the iron shorter and thicker, compressing a bar by hammering it on its end, driving the metal back into itself, thickening a section for a bolt head or a rivet. Punching was making a hole through the iron, driving a tapered punch through the hot metal on the anvil's hardy hole, the displaced iron forming a collar around the punch. And bending was changing the iron's direction, draping the hot bar over the horn of the anvil and hammering it into a curve. 4 operations, Elam told Iva. Draw, upset, punch, bend. Every piece of ironwork in this county, every hinge, every latch, every chain link, every nail, is made from some combination of those 4 operations. A smith who masters those 4 operations can make anything. Eva had also known about the old Creech smithy. Half a mile down the crossroads from the Collier farm, at the junction where the mountain road met the river road, stood a stone building that had been the blacksmith shop of a man named Judson Creech, who had been the finest smith in Patrick County from 1896 until his death in 1942. 46 years of forging iron at a crossroads in the Blue Ridge. Judson Creech could forge weld in 1 heat, Iva told Bray once, on a winter afternoon when they were drawing a bar of iron into a fireplace poker at the forge. 1 heat. That means he brought the iron to white in the forge, pulled it out, fluxed it with borax, folded it, and struck the weld. All before the iron cooled below welding temperature, which gave him about 8 seconds. 8 seconds from the forge to the anvil to the weld. Most smiths need 2 or 3 heats to complete a weld because they are too slow and the iron cools before the weld takes. Judson was never too slow. My father said Judson moved like the iron was telling him when to strike, and the iron was always right. Iva had told Bray other stories from the forge, each one a lesson. She told Bray about tempering, the final heat treatment that gave a forged tool its working hardness. A piece of iron, fresh from the forge, was soft. Too soft to hold an edge. To make it hard enough to cut, the smith heated the finished piece to cherry red and quenched it in water, and the rapid cooling transformed the crystal structure of the iron from soft to glass hard. But glass hard was too hard. A glass hard blade was brittle and would shatter on impact. So the smith tempered the quenched piece by reheating it gently until the surface showed a specific color. Not the forging colors, but the tempering colors, which were thinner and more subtle. Pale straw for a razor's edge, dark straw for a chisel, bronze for a spring, blue for a saw blade. Each color represented a different degree of hardness, and the smith watched the colors creep across the surface and quenched again at the exact moment the right color reached the cutting edge. The temper colors are whispers, Iva told Bray. The forging colors shout, red, orange, yellow, white. The temper colors whisper, straw, bronze, blue. A smith who cannot hear the whisper cannot temper a blade. And a blade that is not tempered is either too soft to cut or too hard to last. She told Bray about the sound of the anvil. A properly struck blow on hot iron produced a specific ring, a clean, bright tone that meant the hammer was landing flat and the force was going into the metal. An improperly struck blow produced a dull thud, the hammer landing at an angle, the force glancing off, the metal not moving as much as it should. The ring is the proof, Iva told Bray. If the anvil rings, the blow was true. If the anvil thuds, the blow was wasted. A smith who listens to the anvil can correct her stroke in real time. Thud, adjust, ring, continue. The anvil is the teacher. The anvil has been the teacher for 3,000 years. She told Bray about the specific relationship between the smith and the iron. The fact that iron was not an inert material waiting to be shaped, but an active material that responded to heat and force in specific ways that the smith had to understand and work with rather than against. Iron had a grain, a directional structure created during its smelting, and the grain affected how the iron moved under the hammer. A smith who drew a bar along its grain produced a smooth taper. A smith who drew against the grain produced a rough taper with surface cracks. Reading the grain was not visual. The grain was invisible. Reading the grain was tactile. The smith felt the resistance of the iron under the hammer, and the resistance told her which direction the grain ran, and she adjusted her drawing direction to follow it. The iron has an opinion, Iva told Bray. The iron wants to go one way. Your job is to find out which way the iron wants to go and go that way. A smith who fights the iron is a smith who makes rough work. A smith who listens to the iron makes clean work. The iron always wins. The question is whether you win with it. Eva had married a man named Hoyt Collier, a cousin, a sawyer who had run a portable sawmill in the Blue Ridge for 20 years, and who had understood that a wife who came home every evening with forge scale on her arms and the smell of coke fire in her hair was a wife whose work was transformation, turning bars of cold iron into the things the mountains needed, and that the transformation was honest work, and the smell was the smell of honest work. Hoyt had died in 2004. Eva had continued alone. Eva and Hoyt had had one daughter, a woman named Alma, who was Bray's mother. Alma had left Patrick County at 18, had moved to Roanoke, had worked as a home health aide, had had Bray with a man named Darrell who had worked at a truck stop and who had left Alma when Bray was 3. Alma had raised Bray alone in a small apartment in Roanoke on the aide's salary, and the apartment had smelled of rubbing alcohol and microwave dinners, and Bray had spent every summer at Iva's cabin at the crossroads because the cabin smelled of coke fire and hot iron and the specific sharp mineral scent of forge scale falling from freshly hammered metal. Bray had been at the cabin every summer from the age of 5 and every school break from the age of 7. Eva had put her to work immediately, at the forge, at the anvil. Iva had taught Bray to read heat color at 6. She had stood Bray beside the forge and had placed a bar of iron in the fire and had said, "Watch. Tell me when it turns red." Bray had watched. The black bar sat in the white fire, and slowly, from the end deepest in the coals, a glow appeared, dark at first, barely visible like the first hint of sunrise. "Now?" Bray said. Iva said, "Not yet. That's black heat, too cool to work. Wait." The glow deepened. Dark red became cherry red. "Now," Iva said. "Cherry red. 1400 degrees. Now the iron is soft enough to shape. Remember the color. Cherry red is the beginning of everything." By 8, Bray could read all 5 forging colors and call them out in order as the iron heated: dark red, cherry, orange, yellow, white, and she could tell Iva within 100 degrees what temperature the iron had reached by color alone. By 10, Eva had put a hammer in her hand, a 2-pound cross-peen hammer smaller than Iva's 3-pound hammer but heavy enough to move hot iron, and had taught her to draw. "Hold the hammer at the end of the handle," Iva said. "Not the middle, the end. The end gives you leverage. Swing from the elbow, not the wrist. The elbow gives you arc. And hit the iron on the flat face of the anvil, not the edge. The flat face moves the metal evenly. The edge digs in." By 12, Bray could draw a 1/2-inch bar into a taper, the taper needed for a fireplace poker or a gate latch, in 3 heats, which was 6 minutes of forge time. By 14, Iva had taught her to forge weld, bringing 2 bars to white heat, fluxing with borax, folding one onto the other, and striking the weld. Bray's first weld had held. Iva had grabbed the welded bar and tried to pull the joint apart. The joint held. "That's a weld," Iva said. "The two bars are now one bar. The iron doesn't know there was ever a joint. That is what white heat does. It erases the boundary between two pieces and makes them one. Welding is not joining. Welding is unifying." By 16, Bray could forge a complete set of fireplace tools, poker, tongs, shovel, and stand, from bar stock in one day. The tools were clean, smooth tapers, square shoulders, tight scroll work on the handles, and Iva had held the poker up to the forge light and sighted down its length and had said, "Straight, not a wobble." "Your eye is better than mine was at 16. Eva had died when Bray was 18. A quiet death at the cabin, on a Saturday morning in October. She had been sitting at the anvil, not forging, just sitting on the stump beside the anvil the way a smith sits when the day's work is done, the fire banked, the hammer on the face of the anvil, the last piece of the day cooling on the floor. She'd been 86. She had forged iron for 29 years. Bray had taken Eva's crosspeen hammer, the 3-pound hammer with the hickory handle worn smooth by 29 years of grip, and her fire poker, the one Iva had forged as a girl from Elam's first iron. After Iva's death, Alma had not wanted Bray back in Roanoke. Bray had gotten a job stacking hay at a cattle farm outside Stewart, $11 an hour, with a bunkhouse room. The farm had sold in the spring of Bray's 21st year, and the new owner did not keep the bunkhouse. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever watched metal change color in a fire and known, by the color, that the metal was ready? She had $10 in her pocket and no car. She had Iva's crosspeen hammer and the fire poker in her rucksack. She was in the general store in Woolwine the following week, buying a tin of coffee with her last change, when she overheard two men at the counter. One of them was talking about old buildings. "The Creech smithy at the crossroads is still standing," the man said. "County's had it on the surplus list since 2006. $10. Anvil's still in there. Nobody can lift it." The other man said, "My grandfather had Judson Creech forge the hinges for his barn in 1934. He said Judson Forge welded the hinge plates in one heat. He said the welds were invisible. You couldn't tell where one piece ended and the other began." Bray set down her coffee. "Where do I sign for it?" The first man looked at her. "County clerk's office in Stewart. You a smith?" Bray said, "My grandmother was." The man paused. "Iva Collier was your grandmother?" Bray said, "Yes, sir." The man, "Eva forged the gate latch on my farm in 1998. That latch has been opening and closing every day for 26 years, and the spring has never weakened. She said a properly tempered spring will outlast the gate." She walked to the Patrick County Clerk's office in Stewart the next morning. The clerk, a man in his 60s named Mr. Pendleton, stamped the deed and handed Bray an iron key on a loop of twisted wire. "The Creech smithy at the crossroads," Mr. Pendleton said. "Judson's son brought this key to this office in 1943 and said, 'Give it to whoever hears the anvil.' Nobody asked." He looked at Bray. "Your grandmother was the last smith in this county who could forge weld. When she died, the weld died with her. There's not a smith between here and Roanoke who can bring two bars to white and make them one." She hitched a ride to the crossroads that afternoon. The smithy stood at the junction exactly as Iva had described. A stone building with a slate roof, a forge chimney on the south end, dark with the soot, and a heavy plank door with iron strap hinges that Judson had forged himself. She put the key in the lock. It turned. One room. Stone walls blackened with 80 years of forge soot. A dirt floor packed hard by decades of standing and striking heavy timber beams. Against the south wall, the forge, a stone and brick hearth with a chimney hood and a bellows, cold and dark. In the center of the room, The Anvil, a 200-pound Peter Wright mounted on an oak stump so massive it was sunk 2 feet into the dirt floor. The anvil's face was polished from 46 years of hammer strikes, the surface mirror bright in the center where the blows had landed, darker at the edges where the iron had been turned, and around the anvil, hanging from iron hooks on the beams, were the silhouettes of tools that had been removed, the shadows of tongs and punches and swages that had hung there for decades, their outlines traced in soot on the wood. The anvil stump was oak, white oak, the same wood the wheelwrights used for spokes, chosen because white oak was dense and heavy and absorbed the vibration of the hammer without bouncing. The stump was sunk into the dirt floor, and the dirt around the base of the stump was different from the rest of the floor, packed harder, tamped more evenly as if the dirt had been removed and repacked. Bray knelt beside the stump and dug at the edge with her fingers. The packed dirt came away in chunks, revealing a gap between the stump and the surrounding floor. And in the gap, fitted tightly against the stump, was an iron plate. She pried the plate up with the tip of Iva's fire poker. Beneath the plate, in a stone-lined cavity sunk into the earth beneath the anvil stump, wrapped in oilcloth, were a leather tool roll, a heavy canvas pouch, and a thick, leather-bound book. The tool roll held a matched set of Blacksmith's hand tools, a pair of flat-jaw tongs for holding flat stock, a pair of bolt-jaw tongs for holding round stock, a hot-cut hardy for cutting hot iron on the anvil, a set of 3 punches, round, square, and slot, a flatter for smoothing surfaces, a fuller for drawing grooves, and a small cross-peen hammer with a handle so dark and smooth it looked like polished stone. Each tool was stamped J.C. Judson Creech. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 34 Liberty Quarter Eagles, dated between 1896 and 1941. The coin dealer and steward valued them at approximately $21,000. The book was an iron journal, page after page of handwritten entries recording every significant piece Judson had forged across 46 years. Each entry noted the date, the customer, the piece, the iron stock, wrought iron, mild steel, or tool steel, the operations used, draw, upset, punch, bend, weld, the number of heats, and a 1-line quality note. March 8, 1917, Pendleton Farm, barn door hinges, pair, wrought iron, forge-welded plates, 6 heats total, welds invisible, the best iron I have worked this year, burden wrought from Troy, grain like river current. 46 years of ironwork. The journal was the structural record of every farm and homestead at the crossroads. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter, "To whoever digs beneath this anvil. My name is Judson Creech. I have forged iron at this anvil from 1896 until today, the 3rd of November, 1942. I am 68 years old. The factories have come. The factories stamp hinges and latches from sheet steel in a press, and the hinges all look the same, and the latches all fail the same. My hinges do not fail because my hinges are forge-welded, and a forge weld does not come apart. I am leaving my tools and my savings and my journal beneath the anvil because the anvil is the heaviest thing in the shop, and what is stored beneath the heaviest thing will not be disturbed. Strike the anvil. Judson Creech, Blacksmith, November 3, 1942. Bray read the letter twice. Then she reached into the tool roll and picked up a single hand-forged nail, a cut nail, about 3 inches long, forged from a rod of wrought iron, the shank drawn to a clean, 4-sided taper, the head upset into a flat square with one blow of the hammer. She held the nail up to the forge light and looked at the taper. 4 sides, each one flat and even, the point sharp, the transitions clean. No hammer marks visible because the drawing had been done in 2 heats and every blow had landed true. She did not cry, and she did not speak. She simply held the nail and looked at the taper and understood that the nail was a 45-second piece of work that had taken 46 years of practice to produce, and the practice was in the taper. she said quietly to the anvil and the forge and the stone walls. "Thank you, Mr. Creech. I will strike the anvil." The next morning, she hitched a ride to Stewart and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Main Street. She opened a checking account and walked out into the October light. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 2000 Chevy S10 with 188,000 miles and Blue Ridge clay on the fenders, from a retired logger in Meadows of Dan for $1,500. The first month was the forge and the bellows. The forge hearth had cracked where water had seeped through the chimney and frozen, and the leather bellows had rotted at the hinge. Bray bought fire brick and bellows leather from a blacksmith supply in Roanoke for $60. Mr. Pendleton from the clerk's office drove out to the crossroads one Saturday morning with a bucket of refractory mortar and helped Bray repoint the forge hearth. "Judson Creech shot every horse at this crossroads for 46 years, Mr. Pendleton said, pressing mortar between the bricks. "My father said Judson could shoe a horse in 15 minutes, pull the old shoes, trim the hooves, forge 4 new shoes, nail them on. 15 minutes. And the horse never flinched, because Judson's hands were steady and a horse knows when the hands are steady." She made the smithy livable in pieces. She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Stewart for $8 and set it against the west wall, across from the forge, so she could lie in the dark and watch the coals die in the hearth and feel the heat radiating from the stone. She did not need a separate stove. The forge itself, once fired, heated the entire shop with radiant heat from the stone hearth and the chimney hood, and the stone held its warmth through the night. A woman named Mrs. Hilton, who ran the general store at the crossroads, walked across the road one Sunday morning with a box of supplies: a coffee pot, 2 enamel mugs, a skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a jar of sorghum, and a round of summer sausage. "Your grandmother forged the door handle on my store in 1999, Mrs. Hilton said, setting the box on the anvil stump. "I open that door 50 times a day. The handle has never loosened. Eva said a properly riveted handle tightens with use because the vibration of opening and closing seats the rivet deeper." She came back every Sunday after that. The first fire she lit in the forge, coke from a supply house in Roanoke, the bellows pumping air beneath, filled the hearth with a white-centered fire that radiated heat across the dirt floor and up the soot-blackened walls, and the walls warmed and released the ghost scent of hot iron and forge scale and borax flux that had been sealed in the stone for 80 years. And the smithy smelled, for the first time since 1942, like a place where iron was being changed. Bray sat on the cot and watched the forge glow and listened to the silence that came after the fire was lit, and before the first bar was placed in the coals, the specific silence of a smithy between fires, the silence that meant the forge was ready and the anvil was waiting, and the next sound would be the ring of hammer on iron. She set Iva's photograph on a stone shelf. Iva at the forge in 1994, hammer raised, a bar of cherry-red iron on the anvil. She placed both cross-peen hammers on the anvil face, Iva's 3-pound and Judson's smaller one side by side, the handles dark and smooth, the faces polished. She hung the iron journal from a nail on the beam above the forge, open to the first entry, April 6, 1896, first day at this anvil. Forged 40 nails for the wool-wine store. Drew each one from quarter-inch rod, headed in one blow. The anvil rings true. I will work here. She got a job in her second year. A historic ironwork restoration company in Floyd hired her 2 days a week, because the owner, a man named Mr. Dalton, had heard from Mr. Pendleton that a young woman at the Creech smithy had Judson Creech's original tools and could forge weld. Mr. Dalton had driven to the crossroads and had watched Bray bring 2 bars to white heat, flux them, fold one onto the other, and strike the weld in 7 seconds. He had grabbed the welded bar and tried to pull the joint apart. The joint held. "That's a forge weld," Mr. Dalton said. "I've been hiring smiths for 20 years, and most of them can't weld in under 3 heats." "You did it in 1. Bray said, "My grandmother taught me to weld at 14. She said 8 seconds from the forge to the weld. I do it in 7. "Mister," Dalton said, "who taught your grandmother?" Bray said, "Her father. Her father learned by watching Judson Creech." On a clear evening in the late October of her 24th year, Bray sat on the stone step outside the smithy door and watched the last copper light fade across the Blue Ridge foothills. The mountains rolled away to the east in layers of blue and purple, the crossroads quiet, the general store closed. Inside the smithy, the forge was cooling from the day's work. She had forged a set of gate hinges that afternoon, forge welded, the welds invisible. And the anvil held the last piece still warm, the iron ticking as it cooled, the small sound of metal contracting, the sound a smith hears at the end of every day. She thought about Judson, who had stood at that anvil for 46 years, forging the hardware that held the crossroads together because he had understood that a forge-welded hinge does not fail, and a hinge that does not fail is a door that always opens, and a door that always opens is a promise. She thought about Elam, who had kept a forge in a stone outbuilding because a mountain farmer who cannot shoe his own horse depends on a trip to town, and the trip to town was half a day. And she thought about Iva, who had forged iron for 29 years and who had taught a 6-year-old to read the color of hot metal because the color was the temperature, and the temperature was the permission. Cherry red meant the iron would allow itself to be shaped. That's the thing about the colors our grandmothers teach us to read. We do not always know, when we are 6 years old and standing beside a forge watching a bar of iron turn from black to red, that the watching is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, heat by heat. And then, 3 years after the old woman dies, we dig beneath an anvil block and find the tools of the man who forged iron at that anvil for 46 years, and we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us that cherry red is the beginning of everything. She had been teaching us that the anvil rings when the blow is true, and the trade is the reading, the patience to watch the iron change color and to strike only when the iron says it is ready. Bray Collier was 21 years old and thrown out. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on an old blacksmith shop at a crossroads in the Blue Ridge foothills of Virginia. It was the best $10 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Thank you for being here. See you on the next Quiet Road.